Hello, this is Stephen Nojiri, and this is another Tada Genji tradition video. This video is actually a very important video, a critical video if you will, because this is a massive correction video. The information provided in this video is going to seek to correct a long-running mistake that I made. Now, I'll take responsibility for this mistake. Now, I'll say it's based on information that I had, but ultimately my mistake. The mistake is that I have been saying that Kumazawa was a chief retainer to the Fukushima Masanori, that the Kumazawa were chief retainers to Fukushima Masanori. This is based on some data that I had. However, I have since learned that this is not accurate. The reality of the situation is that the Kumazawa were, or Kumazawa Morihisa specifically, we're talking about him specifically, the Kumazawa Morihisa was a 400 koku member of Fukushima Masanori's Banshu. Now the Banshu are his bodyguards, his guards, the guys that actually protect him directly. Now, I had made this mistake years ago. Like I said, I made this mistake with the information that I had, and then later on I acquired better information, and I just realized that this mistake is still leaking into my works, and so I have to make this video so that this mistake is put to an end and I don't continue to accidentally say chief retainer when that's not accurate. So, not the chief retainer, but a member of the Banshu. And again, even recently, I've even had this mistake definitely clarified, because I've recently come upon documents that actually support the Banshu reality, meaning that it's double corrected. It's corrected from work, and then it's also corrected through verification of domain registers. So it's pretty locked in stone that the Kumazawa were Banshu to Masanori. So how does this realign the entire picture? So the original idea that Kumazawa was a high-ranking retainer was because the Kumazawa / Nojiri, they had Masanori's ear. They could talk back to him. They could discuss things with him. They took orders directly from him. They handled black ops situations. Some of the top secret things when Fukushima was on the low, was supporting Toyotomi Hideyori, etc., etc. These things, and so I assumed that I knew that they were close retainers, and the false assumption was that close retainer meant that it was a higher rank. But in reality, the Banshu can do all of those things. It just doesn't come with a higher status or a higher payment, right? The koku's not as high, the status in the clan is not as high, and the status in the domain is not as high. But the Banshu specific, and we know from documents, the Kumazawa Banshu they interacted with Fukushima Masanori regularly. Like, they held conversations, they debated things, they discussed things, etc., etc., etc. There was one time when Morihisa was giving a direct order, and he basically said, "This is a stupid order. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to do something else." Right? So but this was because they were Banshu. They were the bodyguards. And interestingly enough, this actually follows the trend of intel operations, or samurai intel operations. Pretty much that is the trend of the time. So in other words, the trend in most other places was that the intel operations were related to Banshu level operations. You saw shinobi or shinobi-like people being converted into guards. So shinobi or samurai spies being converted into guards of some kind was the trend at the time period. And it was the same in the Fukushima Masanori's Hiroshima Domain. Same thing. So they weren't high-level retainers, they were guards, but they had direct access, direct conversation back and forth with Masanori, which is pretty much on point with the time period everywhere else. So, to be clear, the the original mistake was that it was a chief retainer, and then the correction came to the idea that it was some kind of close retainer, and now I have the documentation to definitely say, definitely, that they were Banshu. So it's no longer a theory. The historical documentation says that they were bodyguards. They were the guards. They were the Banshu. They were Masanori's personal guards. Now these records are pre-1619, so it is possible that the Kumazawa may have achieved higher status at some point between when this record was taken and when Masanori, when the Kumazawa went, specifically Morihisa went with Masanori to Shinano, because we know that Kumazawa Morihisa stayed with Masanori until Masanori passed away. Was there ever an increase in rank and status? I don't know. Maybe. Or it's also possible that he remained a Banshu the entire time. Furthermore, it also explains how the Kumazawa and Nojiri how they could have gone from a high koku status to a low koku status very soon afterwards. Because if they were chief retainers, if that had been true, theoretically that was what we were operating off of, but it turns out it's not true. They were Banshu. So how could they have gone? But how would they have gone from chief retainers to Banshu level status so quickly? Pretty much everywhere, not just in Hiroshima Domain, etc., etc. So then the question becomes, how exactly did that take place? Well, if they were, but the answer is they were already Banshu in the Fukushima clan, in the Hiroshima Domain, they were already Banshu. So therefore, going from Banshu to Banshu level sort of statuses, 400 koku down to 30 koku type status makes sense. You don't have to figure out why such a sharp drop in such a short period of time. It's the same status. So it actually explains that actually works a lot better to the overall narrative. So what does that mean? It means that the Kumazawa / Nojiri were close to Masanori. They worked directly with Masanori, but they were not as high ranked as initially estimated. It means that things like the shinobi no jutsu like Fukushima-ryu was developed not because of a chief retainer's actions, but rather it was developed between Masanori and the Kumazawa Nojiri on the level of a lord and his guards. So the original theory was that Fukushima-ryu was created like on a higher pay grade, but really it turns out that it is between the daimyo and his bodyguards. And as previously stated, that actually matches the historical trends of the time much better. That meaning, so the shinobi no jutsu users being guards of various types is the trend for the time period. So it makes perfect sense that Fukushima-ryu would be between Masanori and his Banshu. It makes way too much sense. It also explains why Fukushima-ryu didn't take off in the domain. So one of the questions has been, if Fukushima-ryu was done by a chief retainer, why didn't it get more popular? Like, oh, you know what I mean? Like, if you in domains, if the lord or the chief retainers are like, yeah, this style, the style's super popular, right? Or it has more fame, it has more records in history. But Fukushima-ryu being done between the lord and his guards also explains why it didn't take off. It wasn't a huge, massively sort of spread school. And then lastly, we need to just take a look at the Nojiri aspect of this. We've been talking more specifically about the Kumazawa aspect, and the Kumazawa Nojiri is the same. It's a interwoven family. So the Nojiri, specifically those with the last name of Nojiri, they would have been part of this because the Kumazawa, as Banshu, is the Kumazawa Morihisa, the 400 koku Banshu. The Nojiri would be relatives, but they would have also had connections to some of the other Banshu families, like Hayashi, for example. But in this video, we're not going to look into those connections and relationships, because I can tell you right now, it's very complicated and it's way beyond the scope of this video. But don't think of it just as isolated families. You have to think of it as families related to each other. Nojiri is part of the Kumazawa, but how do they relate to this family? Or how do they relate to this other family that is Banshu, etc., etc., etc.? Now, also the reality is that some of the involved Nojiri almost certainly were Ronin. I haven't talked about this much, but they almost certainly were Ronin. Many of the Nojiri, most of the, many of the people with the actual last name Nojiri were Ronin at some point in the first decade, the first 2 decades of the 1600s. Lots of Nojiri Ronin. So it is the Kumazawa would have been the actual Banshu on the record, and then their family members, their relatives, didn't necessarily have to be formal retainers of the realm. They could have been relatives visiting, like Ronin visiting. They could have been relatives visiting from other domains. So the Kumazawa definitely are Banshu, but the question becomes, were the Nojiri involved actually retainers, or were they relatives? That's the key question. We know that they were involved. The question is, were they considered retainers? Were they visiting Ronin? Were they visiting from other domains? And the answer to that is a little bit of all of that, actually. Now, I know that that complicates the narrative because I have traditionally sort of explained it as the Kumazawa Nojiri were retainers for the Fukushima, but it is actually more complicated than that. But I just want to make sure that the impression is not that all of these people involved were record retainers, at like genuine 100% on record retainers of Masanori. That's not the reality of how the situation worked. So, like I said, Kumazawa was the retainer. He's the Banshu. He's the Banshu on record, 400 koku. Under him are relatives, etc., etc., etc. Some of them are not actual retainers of the domain. This is also why I have said many times that the Fukushima time period is only a small part of the Nojiri Kumazawa story, right? So some people say, "Oh, why don't you harp on Fukushima more and more and more?" Because the Fukushima is only a small part of the story. It's only a 20-year period out of a story that is hundreds of years. It's only a 20-year period. So, anyway, hopefully this video aligns the history, focuses the history, makes the history more accurate, and clears up some of the misunderstandings and mistakes. And in any future publications, I'm going to actually I'll put a chapter of all of this with more detail, etc., 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 to clarify this situation better in future publications. But Sacred Conspiracy is already out. Samurai Traditions of the Tada Genji is out. Now, this doesn't change the material. This doesn't change. The only thing that this changes is that the Kumazawa were not chief retainers. They were bodyguards. And it corrects the mistaken idea that all of the Nojiri were recorded retainers, like all of them were retainers for the Fukushima, when some of them were visiting. Okay, so hopefully that clarifies everything. And like I said, I will put this into publication in the future and include more details, etc. But for now, hopefully this video serves as the placeholder.